Welcome to Season 2 of the Project Hope podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer. As many of you know, I am a cult survivor myself. For anyone interested, you can hear the story of how I got in and how I got out in Season 1, Episodes 1 and 2. The beginning of this year, 2023, actually marks my 11 years of being out, and I am so super grateful for the ways my life has unfolded since. I now work with survivors of coercive control, and I'm going to take a moment here to define this term, as one of my heart's desires is to help society at large better understand coercive control in cases that are not just culty, but across the globe. I view coercive control as a social issue. It's at the heart of cases where women and girls are murdered. We find coercive control in one-to-one relationships that are intimate, in gangs, sex trafficking, and cults of all types. I have a master's in the psychology of coercive control, and I'm just beginning a new element of my career as an expert witness for legal cases that involve coercive control. As a certified trauma professional, I work with survivors. I'm especially excited to be offering a group survivor program for cult and religious abuse recovery. So this is not a support group, but rather a healing program. It's based on my certification in the incredible work of Dr. Jilly Jenkinson, who gathered decades of research on survivors to create a body of work that I would consider to be the most comprehensive and flexible approach I've come across in this field. We will meet every other week for 6 months, and registration will open in February of 2023 for those interested. Lastly, I am also a research associate at Salford University and explore topics related to coercive control. So let's jump back into a basic understanding of coercive control before I introduce the next episode. Coercive control is a strategic pattern of behavior designed to exploit, control, create dependency, and dominate. The victim's everyday existence is micromanaged, and their space for action, as well as potential as a human being, is limited and controlled by the abuser. Initially, the victim may be drawn into the relationship with love bombing and charm. Then gaslighting, isolation, economic control, and financial abuse can take place alongside rules and regulations that are gradually introduced over time and change at the whim of the abuser. The victim knows there are consequences if rules are broken, and they apply to the victim rather than the perpetrator, creating a double standard. Over time, coercively controlling behavior erodes the victim's sense of self, their confidence, self-esteem, agency, and autonomy. The abuser creates an unreal world of contradiction, confusion, and fear. It may be helpful to know that 51% of victims do not even know that they are being abused, manipulated, and controlled. Coercive control correlates significantly to serious harm, and in many cases, in intimate partner violence, it precedes homicide. These can be difficult topics to grapple with, so I truly hope that this podcast helps to protect you and those you love with helpful voices and information. If you appreciate the podcast, please let us know by subscribing and comment with kindness. And always think critically, trust your intuition, and be free. Today we welcome Debby Shriver to the Project Hope podcast. Debby is a cult survivor, advocate, author, and human rights activist. A native of Chicago, Debby earned undergraduate and graduate degrees at the University of Tennessee. Her career led her to serve new students, parents, and undergraduates in the Student Conduct and Orientation Department. Debby spent the last part of her career at the university leading employee training and organizational development. Her focus on children has led her to work as a community volunteer with the Foster Care Review Board, Girl Scouts, YWCA, and American Red Cross. Debby has written a number of books, and she cites as most life-changing her experiences learning from cult survivors while writing Whispering in the Daylight, The Children of Tony Alamo Christian Ministries, and Their Journey to Freedom. Alamo's story is chronicled in the Sundance TV docuseries Ministry of Evil, The Twisted Cult of Tony Alamo, in which Debby appears as their cult expert. Presently, Debby serves as the president of the International Cultic Studies Association and founder and executive director of Keys to Me. While I encourage all of our listeners to regard this podcast as containing possibly sensitive or triggering information, in this two-part series, we do address content around sexual and physical abuse, so please do take care as you listen. It was such a pleasure to speak with Debby, and I'm sure you'll find her history fascinating as it all seems to culminate so beautifully into her current work of advocacy, education, and of course her work with the children of the Tony Alamo Ministries, which, as you will hear, has led to a beautiful alliance and continued relationship between them. Give us a little bit of the journey of Debby Shriver into the cultiverse. How on earth did you land here? Okay.
Yes. Well, I grew up in Chicago, Illinois, and I was an only child, and I didn't realize it at the time, but I grew up in a very abusive home. My mother was an incredible educator. She was not a mother. And she basically, I went to public school, but she controlled everything about me. She wouldn't let me go to parties. She wouldn't let me have birthday parties. She wouldn't let me have friends. If I liked pink and that wasn't a color she liked, I was wrong. It was very controlled. I thought everybody was like that because I grew up really frightened of everybody and everything because I was, if I caused any problems, she would take to the bed and say I was making her stomach hurt. My father was absolutely my hero. I loved him, but I always wondered, why can't he take me away from here? But of course, I grew up in the 50s and he would not have been able to do that. I would have been left with my mother. Yep. And as I got older, he would take me on trips and we were very, very close. But I grew up in a very controlling environment. And I also, though, grew up in Chicago, and my mother was an educator and her students loved her. Everybody in the outside world loved her, which is often the way cult leaders are, with the outside persona and inside persona. At the time, I didn't know that, but I would hate it that people loved her because they had no idea what she was like.
Well, this is the classic coercive controlling relationship, right? Where you're really trapped in your own reality with the individual. Oh, and fascinating that this is part of your history, of course.
Yes. And, so we did lots of things. Everything we did was educational. And I got bored. I didn't get bored, but I felt like I was just always on duty to learn. And as an adult, I can look back and say, I learned a lot, and we did lots of really fun things. But it wasn't spontaneous. I wasn't playing as a child. I'll give you a funny example. It's a funny example. It's so weird. My mother decided I needed to learn about different cultures in different parts of the world. So each week I was assigned a country. It was my job to learn everything I could about it. And I would then kind of write a report, and I would dress as if, I lived in that country, and I would just have to sort of piecemeal with, kind of make it up. And then on Sunday, we would have a meal, and she would prepare a meal from that country. And I would report to my mother and my dad, with my report, and dress in the costume. And it was just so bizarre. But
Debbie, how fascinating. It's like training to be an international attaché.
Yeah, it was so bizarre. And she did weird things like that. One time when we were out on a country drive, mom and dad loved to go out drive in the country on weekends. And we'd go on a drive, and we got off the road. It was in the fall, and I was in the back seat. And I loved these ventures because I could just be in the back seat and look around the world and be in my own little bubble. And I noticed we got off the highway and we were on a bumpy road. So I looked up, and we were driving up to a country house. And I thought, what are we doing? And I sat there, and my mother got out of the car, went up to the door, knocked. And when the person answered, she said, "We're from the city, and we'd like to come to your house for Thanksgiving so we can have an authentic Thanksgiving dinner."
Oh my goodness.
And I hit the ground. I just went down on the floor of the car, and the door slammed, and my mother got in the car, and my father just peeled it out of there. I mean, she just was bizarre, so bizarre.
Funny. That is so fascinating. So do you kind of connect some of that experience to this sort of journey that you've traveled into education and writing, and give us a little bit of kind of the movement forward of where this journey takes you?
Yes, I grew up wanting to leave home. And I knew the way to leave home would be through education.
Yeah.
So, and in those days, I don't think it's as common today as it was then. And that's sort of my editorial comment. But in those days, pretty much everybody I knew at school, we all planned to go away to college and leave home and not come back. Yeah. Some not for bad reasons, although mine were because I didn't want to be in my home anymore. But I don't think it's that way anymore so much. And there are positives and minuses about that. But so I worked really hard to get out of there and selected some colleges of interest. And my dad took me, during my junior year in high school, took me to college visits, and I selected my college. And we made a big loop in the country, and we came back home through Tennessee. We went to the Smoky Mountains just to see it. We finished my visits, and my dad said, "Oh, look, there's a university here. Let's just see what it's like." And so we stopped at the University of Tennessee, and there was an outdoor swimming pool that looked like a country club. And it struck me. I couldn't believe there was an outdoor swimming pool on a college campus, being from Chicago and being kind of, in my own little world. And so there we were, looking like tourists, and the university president, whose name was Andy Holt, and he was quite a charismatic man, built the university from a small school to a very large and thriving system across the state. But Andy Holt was walking along and stopped us and welcomed us and talked to me. And he recruited me to the University of Tennessee, basically. He followed my path. And I came to the University of Tennessee because of Andy Holt and a swimming pool. My friends people would say to me, "They don't wear shoes in Tennessee. Why are you going there?" Because Tennessee was just such a foreign land to someone from Chicago. Yeah. And I have to say, when I first came down here, I was very unhappy. It wasn't a city. and it was very different. It was a different culture. But I ended up doing fine, and never thought I'd stay here, but I ended up having my career here and staying here. And I'm still here.
And I can imagine also with the university experience, when you entered into that, was that kind of the first time that you were also potentially kind of making friends who were in your age group? And because that can be a real kind of opening, freeing time in one's life.
I decided, I can remember consciously deciding that I was going to be somebody else. I was not going to be that little girl in Chicago. I was going to be outgoing. I was going to smile at people. I was going to create a different self.
Yeah.
And I was really good at compartmentalizing. I compartmentalized a lot in my life, and that's not always good. It can also be very helpful. And it helped me, I think, get through all those years. But when I came to Tennessee when I was 18, I projected a different person. And I went through a lot of angst about that, because I felt like a fake. I think sometimes people who come out of groups can sort of feel like, who am I now? And people respond to pieces of you that don't feel as authentic.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it was a little bit tricky. And I was very successful. And I sort of felt like an imposter a lot of the times. It took me years to step into who I really am and to kind of integrate those childhood versions of me as well.
Oh, and I'm sure so many people can relate to that, both having experienced kind of a cult life, but also beyond that, because there are elements, that we're all trying at certain times in our lives or exploring. And then it's hard when you receive positive feedback for something that you're kind of questioning or not sure is authentic for you.
Yeah.
But also, isn't that the time? I mean, it's amazing the way we cope and kind of emerge into ourselves, so I'm so glad, Debbie, that we're kind of talking about this journey, because it's really interesting to kind of hear these different components. And then take us sort of beyond college and kind of where you go in your career, kind of leading to becoming an author.
Mm-hmm. Well, in college, I was an English major. I really loved to write. I was in the College of Liberal Arts, and I really had no idea what I wanted to do when I grew up. I was in college from 1968 to 72 as an undergraduate, and those were really passionate years to be in college.
Yes. Wow.
And that's when many of the cults that we talk about were formed.
Yes.
I went to Woodstock, and I'm very proud of that. That's one of my great accomplishments in life. But it was an exciting time to be in college. It was also a scary time. I remember sitting around the radio with my male friends, listening for their lottery numbers to be called to go to Vietnam.
Yeah.
It was a very different time. And I think we made a lot of headway in human rights at that time. And so I grew passionate for human rights and people who suffered during my college years. I also really had a sensitivity to people who are sort of on the fringe and not the most popular people in the world, because I always felt like that person.
Yeah.
And when I graduated, I had gotten accepted at Ohio State University, and I was going to go into clinical psychology. And that was just sort of, well, I guess that's what I'll do next. And I was at the university. I was here in Knoxville for that summer before I would go on. And the university, somebody who was in the Dean of Students office, contacted me and said, "Are you interested in a job?"
Oh.
I said, "Okay." I just threw everything away, and I said, "Okay." And it was being in charge of an orientation program, developing one for new students and their parents. And so I did that, and it became my passion. I loved it. I hired 22 students every year to put together an orientation program, and they became, for them, it was a leadership development experience. And I always picked students that would never naturally come together. And I always picked students who would grow from that experience, not people that had already arrived. And so, as a result, people who did that, they were called SOAs, student orientation assistants. They, to this day, say that was the best job they ever had. And it truly, I got to do it every year. So it was really my best job. But I really tuned into students who came from small towns, whose towns didn't have as many people as one of our parking lots would have cars. I would drive through the state, through the rural areas, and see where our students came from. And it was so different for me because I grew up in a city.
Right.
And when students came to orientation, I kept my own little list of students that I worried about. Yeah. And I would contact them between orientation and fall quarter. We were on the quarter system then. And they would come see me during the year. And I kind of help give them a boost, help them with what they needed. And my job grew into working with students who got in trouble and had problems. And usually they got in trouble because they were troubled.
Yes. Yep, I do.
Yeah.
There's always really good reasons that, underneath the surface of why we act out.
Yeah.
So, wow, neat. And so then did that kind of progress into more academia?
Well, the funny thing is I worked with every aspect of the university in acclimating students to college. And I continued to work on my graduate degrees while I worked at this job. And I went into counseling psychology because psychology was still in the back of my mind, but I was starting to really love higher ed.
Yeah.
And so I was looking at higher ed degrees at that time. And I knew that if I wanted to work in higher ed, I'd need to go to another college for a graduate program and go to another college after that for work experience to truly be able to be fully prepared to work in student affairs or academic affairs. And I ended up marrying a Knoxville person, and he tried really hard to find a job where I found jobs, and we couldn't find one. And as it turned out, he was offered a really good job here, and I was offered a good promotion. So I kind of made the decision. I think sometimes women in particular, we talk about where do we turn off from our career paths?
Yeah.
And I consciously made the decision. I'm probably not going to be a vice chancellor for student affairs. I'm probably not going to achieve quite what I had first thought. But I really love working here, and I'm really happy with a lot of things about being here, and was committed to my husband at that point. So it worked out. I ended up being really successful in student affairs. I got involved in lots of higher ed organizations, worked with the group that first created the alcohol awareness program for colleges. This is really dating me. I mean, you weren't even alive when this was happening. But I grew a lot, and I sort of saw my personal mission to grow as needing to break out and work with other organizations and work nationally with universities so that I could make up for the regional aspect I had just working at Tennessee.
Yeah.
I learned a lot and hosted some national conferences and created a national organization and learned. It was a great job. And I got my master's degree and worked on my doctorate degree. Did not achieve that, but it was out of choice. And that's where my writing kind of comes in. That's where I came kind of full circle.
Okay.
Writing helps you in any job, as you know.
Yeah.
So I did a lot of writing, but I didn't do the kind of writing I wanted to do. And so when I had that fork in the road and decided, well, maybe I'm not going to finish my dissertation here, but I'm going to take my dissertation and I'm going to make a book out of it because it's really important to me. And the topic was a journal written by a young woman in 1810. Her name was Rachel Van Dyke. Oh. And I found it in special collections at Rutgers University. No one had done anything with it. It was in a box, and it was a year long. And I read it, and it was so compelling, really compelling. Oh. And Rachel actually taught me my mission as a writer. My mission as a writer is to give volume to the voices of others. And hers was a voice that needed to be heard. She was very kind of modern in her thinking. She was a real advocate for education for women, for education for enslaved Americans. She lived in New Jersey, and they had enslaved Americans there. And she talked about how she viewed that system and how terrible it was, and how they couldn't be educated, and how terrible that was. And she was just really remarkable. And so that defined me as a writer.
Isn't that amazing, Debbie? I mean, just, to think about for a moment kind of our legacy and the impacts that we have, and that you might discover this book in a box at Rutgers while living in Knoxville, Tennessee, and just that this woman's story would matter and affect and change the trajectory of your life, let alone, the people that are reading, obviously, about her. It's just amazing.
Oh, it was a turning point for me. It really was. And during that time, we adopted a little baby. Oh. And she came to us when she was 6 weeks old. And now she's a grown woman and has children of her own. But during that time, I was writing and I was working full time. And I really decided I wanted to work part time because I wanted to spend more time with my daughter. Yeah. And so I shifted gears a little bit. I continued to work at the university, but I worked in training and development, human resources. And I sort of saw myself as the voice of students there. I'd heard so many staff people say, if it weren't for the students, this would be a great place to work. And that always appalled me. And so I thought, I'm going to take the student voice over here to staff and faculty. And for a while, that worked, but not really. A university has so many silos, so many cultural silos. And when people go to training programs, they go over, they leave their little silo and come to another one. But when they go back, no one in their silo has experienced what they've learned. And there's no way to reinforce new learning. And they just have to catch up with what they missed doing while they were at training. And some training programs were really, I don't mean to just blast it, but some training programs were really successful when the entire department did it. Bottom up, everybody. And there were some really fulfilling times through that period. But at some point, I thought, I do not want to be the person that everyone's saying, when is she going to retire?
Oh my God.
So I retired early. I had worked 32 years, but I started working right out of college, 21. Yeah. And I was just very fortunate that so many things came my way, and I was really fortunate. And so I did retire, and that's when writing happened. University of Tennessee Press contacted me and said, somebody's just written a great book about football. Would you write a book about women's basketball? we had Pat Head Summit, who is she was just an amazing woman, trailblazer in basketball and really for all sports for women. And I knew her well. And, I said, I'd love to do that, but it needs to be about all the sports, not just basketball. And so I was given the opportunity to write a book about all the women's sports at the university and the history of Title IX. And it was wonderful. And again, I pulled voices that needed to be heard out here. And it was really fun. It was a lot of fun. And since then, I've written lots of different books. And they've all been voices that needed to be heard.
Yeah. Well, and how fascinating that you wanted the advocacy for all of the women's voices across sports, and this is all relevant even today. I mean, what's happened with the Women's National Soccer League is just fascinating.
Yes.
I mean, so very interesting that you're kind of a part of that history in a way. It's really, Debbie, do we kind of jump forward to how we enter into you writing Green in the Daylight?
Yes. I guess what might help is for me to talk about how I became more focused on children.
Great.
While along with all this writing, remember I had a little girl. Yeah. And I wanted to spend a lot of time with her, and she's an only child. Remember, my only child experience was really not good.
Yeah.
And so I imported kids all the time. I was the mom that always was involved with all the kids. And Kate, my daughter, wanted me there. I was glad that she did. But she was a Girl Scout. And
I wish, Debbie, I don't mean to interrupt, but I just got back from Hawaii and I learned that there's a word there that I will not be able to recall. But there is a term for when you adopt children into your family, where they kind of become like your family, that there's an actual word for that,
Oh, I have to look that up.
I know. And everybody acknowledges it, and this is a so-and-so, like meaning she's an adoptee of your family, and she's got parents who love her and everything, but she's still adopted by other families.
I love that. Oh, I love that, because I found families I would like to be adopted by.
Yes. Love it. It's so important. I mean, to me, that I do end up kind of in conversations with friends of mine about just, how our world has shifted and sort of the importance of having that familial quality, whether it's biological or not, and just, kind of the value of that, which happens to be one of my values. And of course, that may not be the case for everyone, but there really just is something so important about kind of being seen and known intimately and cared for,
Absolutely. And I think, I know we'll talk more about this, but I think that's one of the pieces that cult leaders break apart. It's a common thread of leaders to pull families apart and keep them apart and restructure them. And that's so harmful.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Yeah.
So I started tuning into children because of my daughter. And I was a Girl Scout leader for years. And we lived, in a kind of middle-class neighborhood. So I always took them to places that were not as privileged. And we worked a lot with other Girl Scout troops from other areas, rural areas, underserved areas, because I really wanted them to know what life is really like, that, I could say, let's go to the zoo, and they would all have enough money to do that and to buy something. So we did it differently, so they would really understand and learn about the value of what they have.
Well, and those I think are such important and wonderful lessons, especially when you're younger, because you don't have all the stuff that we have, all the criticisms and the judgments and the layers of our own experience as you get older. And I very much remember being impacted in that way. My family happened to do a lot of international travel when I was very young. And those are memories that absolutely sculpted kind of who I am, because we were seeing things that, were very, very different from the way that I actually grew up. So, yeah, those are excellent. Okay, so.
So you see the world is bigger than yours, and that's really important. So I worked with the Girl Scouts. I ended up being president of the council here and getting into the governance piece of it as Kate grew older, and really saw a lot of children in need through that. And during that same time, I got on the board of the YWCA, which is an advocate for women in domestic abuse and bullying, anti-bullying programs. So I learned a lot there, and worked as a Red Cross volunteer, training people to work in shelters and managing shelters. And that was working with a lot of stressed people that were displaced. We would always get the New Orleans hurricane crowd would come here. And, so I taught. I would get college students. We'd have to find people to work in the shelters, and I would get college students, use my daughter to round up people and train them. And we had to deal with lots of dysfunction of families who already didn't work well together or get along well, or there was abuse there, and they weren't in their private homes anymore. They were in a shelter with a lot of other people, and the dynamics are really difficult. I was appointed to the foster care review board here by the juvenile judge, and that pretty much put a cap on that really focused me on what happens in the foster system. Yes. And the children who, the foster system is not, children don't go into foster care because they've done something wrong. They go into foster care because their home is not safe for them. Yeah. But it takes 6 months to a year for their birth parents to work their permanency plan so that they can, in fact, get their child back. Many times they don't even start it. But to terminate parental rights, it takes at least 6 months, and many times longer, unless the birth parents are just willing to do it right away. And normally they're not. And so a child then is taken from the only home they've known. And it could have been a dirty, infested, abuse-driven home, but it's the only home they knew. And it's the only version of love they have. And all of a sudden they're dropped into a whole nother family in another part of town, usually, another county sometimes. And then they're expected to thrive, and they can't. And they end up then acting out eventually, wouldn't you? And so then the foster family says, we can't control this person. So then they go to another house and another home and another home. And the older they get, the less adoptable they are. Oh. And, the little kids, once parental rights are terminated, little kids get adopted, babies get adopted, but the older kids don't. And so they already feel abandoned by their parents, rejected by the system. They don't trust anybody. And then when they're 18, there they go. Now, most states now have a program that is a life skills kind of program that they can opt to stay in for another year. And it's a very good program. But again, a lot don't opt to do that. And the foster system needs more foster parents, needs foster parents who are trained adequately. And this is kind of where the cult awareness came. That's where all of a sudden I dropped and my world was turned right side up, truly. I had written a bunch of things, and I'd been involved with child advocacy and working in these community agencies. And it's sort of odd, but a man from Arkansas was on contract work here in Oak Ridge, which is near Knoxville, with my husband. My husband worked there, and they were talking, and this man learned that I'm a writer. And he said, I have some kids that need to write a book. I need her to write a book about my kids. And Rob said, what do you mean? And so Rob came home, my husband, and said, so I met this guy who adopted a bunch of kids who were taken from a cult, and he wants you to write their story.
Oh, and Debbie, how wild.
I said, what? No, there's no way I could do that. I do not have the skills. I do not have the knowledge. There's no way. What in the world are you talking about? And he said, would you please just meet with them? Please just meet with them. Yeah. So I said, okay. So I met him at Panera Bread. His name's Jess. And Jess said, my wife really thinks this is the only thing that's going to work. These kids were taken from Tony Alamo Christian Ministries in an FBI raid in 2008. And they're very smart, and they know how to follow rules, and they do. They present well. They're succeeding in public school. They're doing very well, but they're not talking. They're not creating relationships with anyone. And we think maybe if they'd write a book, if they would write a book, it would help them get some of that emotion out. And I said, Jess, I am not equipped to do that. You need a therapist in their lives, and they won't talk to therapists. So they, and we can get into that. But I said, I just don't know enough I don't know about cults. I don't know this area. And he said, would you just talk to my wife? Because she needs to talk to you because she really wants this. Yeah. And I said, I'll tell you what I'll do. I will see if I can find someone who could do this for you. And I'll meet with your wife. Her name's Tanya. I said, I'll meet with Tanya, but hopefully by then I will have thought of someone. And I talked to therapists. I talked to people at the university. I couldn't find anybody. So here comes Tanya.
Debbie, and here I am from the outside perspective. It's like the stars have aligned to make it all so perfect that it's you.
It's so hilarious. I know. Well, so I go to Panera Bread, and there's Tanya, and she is about 4 feet tall with long, bright, flaming hair and freckles. And she looked at me and said, why do you want to write a child about my kids? Why do you want to write a book about my kids?
Oh, no.
And I said, I don't want to write a book about your kids. And she said, well, Jess said you want to write a book about my kids. I said, no. I said, I'd find someone because he said you wanted to write a book about your kids. And all of a sudden we looked at each other and said, we've been set up. So we sat down in Panera Bread.
Someone else had an agenda.
Yeah, it was so funny. And we talked and laughed about it. And she told me about the children. And at that time, the oldest one was 17. And there were others that were older than that. But and they were unofficially the foster home for them still. But they had aged out. But they had actually adopted a sibling group and another child, and unofficially served as parents to others. She had basically she kept buying different houses to have enough beds for the children. That's a story in and of itself. Oh, yeah. And I have in the book, I have a bit about that, but Tanya and I talked, and at the end, we were there for hours. And in fact, people would kind of look at us and laugh and say, I want to talk to you guys. You all are having a lot of fun. Anyway, she ended up saying, I really want you to write the book. And I said, it's going to have to depend on a lot of things.
Yeah.
They are going to have a therapist during this stretch. They have to.
Yeah.
Because if I write this book, it's going to stir them up.
Amazing for you to really have the wherewithal. I mean, once again, Debbie, another little stamp on how perfect you were as this person really in this role, because a lot of people maybe wouldn't even have the wherewithal to really understand what's going to transpire. I mean, as we dive into our survivor stories, it is quite something, so emotional, and there's lots there. So
well, you're right. And I think there are a lot of people who could do it. I happen to be the person that was there at the time, but there are also a lot of people who would sensationalize it and see dollar signs. And I said, and why do you want to write this book? And she said, well, to help them express, but also I'd like them to get some money to go to college. And I said, okay, you don't make money writing books.
Yeah.
And people think you do, but you don't. Books, you don't make money writing books. And so you've got to just decide it's not going to make any money for that.
Yeah.
And I said, and I have to meet the kids, and it's their decision. Yeah. And I'm going to ask them things, and they're going to talk to me, and it's going to be confidential. If, in fact, I think they need to talk to you and tell you something that they've told me, I'll get them to you. I'll say either I'm going to tell Tanya, or together we will, or you will by yourself. I won't be a middle person, but I will not tell you everything they tell me. Yeah. And as long as that's not harmful. And I said, and the other thing is, it's going to take a while, because I have to learn about cults. I have to learn. I don't know. I have to learn. I have a lot to learn before I even start writing this. Yeah. And so she absolutely agreed. And soon after that, I started meeting the kids. And this was sort of the turning point. I met a couple of them here in Knoxville. But I went to Arkansas, and Tanya and Jess had a big potluck supper. And it was in March. And the weather was kind of nice. And they had a big fire pit in the backyard. They had a pretty big area. And people came, like there were members of the cult who came, parents of some of the kids. There were parents who had left the cult.
Oh, yeah.
Lots of children, and who had been taken. And some law enforcement people were there. Some of their high school counselors were there. And I didn't have a notepad or a pen or a recorder or anything. My goal then wasn't to start writing. It was just to earn trust and to talk to them and see if, in fact, I could do it. Yeah. And, I started reading every book I could lay my hands on about cults, about trauma. And
can I ask you, Debbie, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Okay.
I am curious, as you're painting this picture for us, were you at all intimidated as you kind of walked into this scene? Did you realize that there were going to be so many stakeholders there? And did it kind of shift things for you at all to kind of see how many people felt invested in meeting you?
I didn't feel intimidated as much as struck by the number of people and the different stakeholders. And I was intimidated isn't the word, but challenged, really challenged. I saw the importance. I saw that it had a platform that was really important to honor.
Oh, and that, I mean, really just from the little, my little foray into podcasting and receiving survivor stories, which is kind of nothing really like writing an entire book that's going to kind of encapsulate the experience of so many and be regarded as, sort of the source and the text of this group and all the voices and all the experiences. I mean, really, so I do in my own way understand kind kind of how we journey with those stories, and that they matter, we, in sharing those stories, receive a gift from survivors, that there is a very, for myself at least, I'll say there's a very distinct, not pressure, that's the wrong word, responsibility, a very distinct responsibility that I feel in holding those stories for others to receive, so I can imagine really feeling kind of the gravity of that, even if you don't really know what you're getting into. It's like to see all the stakeholders and realize how much it matters and how important this story is.
You're right, Jennifer. When a survivor entrusts their story to us, that's a big honor, and they're vulnerable. It's a big deal to do that. And I, more than anything, I admire the courage of all these individuals, just their courage. It's really difficult.
Yeah, it is. And it's also, I'm just feeling that impression of also just how much it matters. I mean, there's no way to understand in the way that we do when we hear directly from individuals what their stories are. I mean, it's really very powerful. And I think the gift of that also is that really it's when people are able to speak, there is such a high chance that story will have some beautiful, impactful experience for somebody else as well.
Absolutely. So at that event, with all those different people, I just kind of wandered through, and I was everyone knew who I was, obviously. And there was one individual who had testified in Tony Alamo's trial. He was about 18 at this time when I met him, and I knew his story, and he was very brave, and he testified publicly. So he was sitting on a lawn chair outside, and it was getting to be dusk, and he was by himself, and I knew that he knew I knew his story. And so I went out and sat down and said hello and said who I am. And he said, I know who you are. And I said, tell me about this. Just tell me, what do I need to know? And he started talking. And as he and I started talking, more and more people came out. And honestly, it was remarkable. Ended up being probably 100 kids sitting in the backyard around a fire pit. And I would just hear their voices, and they'd chime in, and it was daunting. At one point I said, did any of you all have Social Security numbers? I knew they didn't, and they said, no, we didn't. Nope, didn't have one. And some of them said, still don't have one. And I said, did you have birth certificates? Nope, never had that. And then there was silence, and somebody said, wow, that means nobody knows about us. And then someone else said, we could have been killed and nobody would ever know that we even existed. And the place just got dead silent. And I said, do you think that happened? Now, I will tell you, that was not Tony Alamo's MO. He abused terribly physically, but he did not kill people to my knowledge. But when I said, do you think that could have happened? It was silent, and somebody said, yeah, I think it could. And that told me how much fear they had. I mean, they all agreed they could have been killed. And the truth is, his followers would have killed had he told them to.
That's just what I was going to say. I mean, we have the story, of course, of the boy who was severely beaten.
Yes.
And that is just, I mean, it's so horrific to hear that story. But I think Debbie, this is one of the ones for me where people have such a difficult time understanding what happens in these dynamics. But it is all symbolic, right? The fact that a parent would beat a child to the point where, they can't move, where there's blood all over the place.
Right.
This is severe behavior. And it really shows you just where the parents' mentality are at, because parents don't do that. When they,
No, no, they don't. They don't.
And honestly, I think of those poor parents too. I don't know, how many are kind of mentally in versus out. That was actually sort of a question that I have for you. But, I really do think of those parents as well. And just, the heartbreak of having to eject your mindset from what you have believed and what you have done as a result of that belief. And to actually have to face that. It is just a layer of brutality of the healing that is horrific,
The shame is so deep. I know we'll get back to this, but I can't help saying this now. When the book came out, I received all of a sudden a bunch of criticism from first gen members, the parents who were out. And they said, "How dare you write about our children? You should be writing about me." And I thought, what? I didn't get it. And so I started communicating with them. And when I went to California, most all of them were in California. And that's where the first compound was. And I went there to roll out the book in California and arranged to meet with some of these individuals. And it was wonderful. I really learned so much from them. And I learned that they were the first children.
Right.
They were the first children.
They were.
And, their children now, the second generation born and raised kids, are not willing to, they're so angry. And their parents are embarrassed and ashamed and don't know how to go forward. And there's such a gap. It's such a gap. And it's just heartbreaking.
Oh, it really is. Yes.
It really is.
Yeah. Yeah, that is very tough situation.
But getting back to Arkansas, getting this story, I met with them till late, and I said to the group, I'm going to be in this hotel. Here's my room number. And I'm just going to be in there, and you can come talk to me if you want to. And I won't write anything you don't want me to write. And I just need to learn. I need you to teach me about your lives. And they came and they came and they came. And one mother came with her 13-year-old daughter, and she had a wine cooler, and she said, "I'm sorry, my daughter really wants to tell you her story. And the only way she can do it is if she drinks this wine." Wow. And, she'd been raped by Tony. Oh. And she didn't want that. I did not write her story in the book, but I created that story about someone else so that it was on record, and she was okay with that. But that was very, very difficult for me. That's when I realized I needed a therapist to do this work. But also during that time, a young man came to see me, and he had grown up in the cult, and told me where he lived. And I said, "I'm going there tomorrow to see it." And he said, "Oh, I wish I could take you there." And I said, "Is there any way you could go with me?" And he said, "I'll ask." And he called his parents, and they said, "Sure." So Fort Smith is where it was. So we drove to Fort Smith, and we drove by the church, and, and I use church in quotes, we all know it's not really a church, but the sign, said Wednesday nights, public welcome, Sunday hours of worship. And I said, I would love to go to a service. What would they do? What do they do if somebody comes in off the street? And he said, well, somebody's assigned to you right away. Someone will sit next to you, and they'll hold back. Basically, they'll play a role. Yeah. And I said, man, I'd love to get in there. And he said, well, I can get you. Like the compound was guarded with guns, with people with guns, and it had barbed wire around it. It was a big piece of property. And he said, I can get you in there. And I said, let's go. And we left everything in the car, didn't have any kind of ID with us. And we crawled under barbed wire, and we went into that compound. And it was just remarkable. This young man regressed when we were there. It was really, he was so brave. He was so brave. And we ended up, of course, getting caught. And he was so smart. He's the first guy that came along. We were in the foyer of the church, and this guy was walking down the hall, kind of scratching his head. And my buddy said, hey, hi, Steve, remember me? I'm so-and-so. And it threw him a little bit. And he said, oh, yeah, where have you been? How you doing? And he said, I'm doing fine. I have this friend here. I want to show her the church. Can you hit the lights? And I'm just thinking, oh, my God. So we went in, we see it. And there were some musical instruments down on the stage. And this young man picked up the guitar and said, this is my dad's guitar. And he said, see, this is where I scratched it. He got mad at me when I scratched it right here. And then he strummed it and he said, it's in tune. My dad's here.
Oh my gosh.
And we had already talked about, I'd had the question, what would you tell your dad if you had him in front of you? So I knew what he would tell him if he saw him. Yeah. And I said, we've got to keep moving. Got to keep moving. I mean, I knew we were on borrowed time because this guy who hit the lights wasn't going to be the only one we encountered. We got out of the sanctuary, and here came another man who was a little bit more with it. And my guy did the same thing. Hey, how are you? I have a friend. And he said, and this other guy opened his flip phone. There were flip phones then. And he said, your father's here. Why don't we call him? And my young man took his phone and closed it and said, oh, no, I want to surprise him. He was so quick-witted on his feet. Wow. And so we turned to leave. And there was a document that I'd been trying to find. Everybody I interviewed said, you need a fellowship book. And, it's like a yearbook for a church with pictures and all that kind of stuff. And they'd say, oh, I wish I still had my fellowship book. So everyone I interviewed, I always asked do you have a fellowship book? Well, this young man looked at a table and said, oh, look, fellowship books. And I went over there and just grabbed as much as I could take. And we just jetted out of there and left. And the phone started ringing then. And he said, I know where my dad lives. I want to go see him. He's here. So we went, and I witnessed that. And it was really heartbreaking, just heartbreaking. These kids, their parents could have taken them back in custody if they agreed to leave the church. Yeah. But they said, no, we're staying with Tony Alamo's church instead of taking our kids back. And, so he wanted to know from his dad, why didn't you come for me? Why did you not take me back? You were my hero. And his dad just started spouting verse to him and calling him names. And he was just horrible. And this young man said, I guess I'll have to be my own hero now, which was such a paradigm shift. Wow. So the phone was just ringing like, by then everybody knew that he'd been in there, and he was crying, he was screaming, but he was also feeling kind of tough and strong because he'd done this. He'd faced his father. And I earned trust then. It was like I earned my stripes. Yeah. and everybody just opened. And I didn't write anything that everybody read everything I wrote before it was published. And the little band of those kids that I wrote about, it's just a small group, but I interviewed over 350 people for the book. And this little group became, they're my family. They're just my family. And, when Tony Alamo died, we had a little retreat and we talked about it. And I was so shocked at what they said. I asked them, so how do you feel? And I expected that they would have conflicted feelings, but I didn't expect this. But they said, it's not fair. He gets to die and we have to live with all this stuff he's made us into.
Wow.
He gets to die, but we don't. And so their anger, their sadness, their grief, everything is still so churning inside of them. It's just so sad. It's so sad. And, the kids that grew up there, their brains were wired differently. And that's true. You know about that. Your brains are wired differently, and you don't know what trust is. You don't know empathy. There's so many rules, and the rules change all the time. So you're very insecure. You're a little bit paranoid. And I don't mean to use those words that are clinical words, but I mean it in just the everyday sense that you're looking over your shoulder. You're not trusting others. And to this day, they're really more friends with others, survivors of cults, than they are with people who are on the outside and always have been.
Yeah.
It's like, when do I bring it up? When do I tell somebody, when I become best friends? When do I say all of a sudden, oh, by the way, this is where I grew up? Yeah. It's very hard. And they didn't know anything before the year 2008, nothing out here. So they didn't know anything. They didn't know music. They didn't know Disney. They didn't know computers. They knew nothing. They didn't know how to buy gum. And what they believed about the outside world was that we were going to kill them.
Yeah.
And it's just so horrific. And it comes back to the children for me. No child is safe in a coercive environment, period.
We so hope that you enjoyed this episode, and please stay tuned for part of Leaving the Cult, the Season 2 song written by Jaya Suri. And for all things related to Jaya, her music, ways that you can support her, check out